What we are witnessing in the Caribbean right now is not simply a military deployment or a routine counter narcotics operation. This is a calculated economic confrontation with potentially catastrophic implications for global markets. And I want to walk you through exactly what the numbers tell us about where this could lead. Let me start with the fundamental economic reality that everyone needs to understand. Venezuela sits on 303 billion barrels of proven oil reserves. That is not a typo. 303 billion barrels, representing approximately 17% of the world's total proven reserves. To put that in perspective, that is more than Saudi Arabia, more than Iraq, more than any other single nation on earth. Yet, Venezuela is currently producing only around 950,000 barrels per day as of October 20. At their peak in the late 1990s, they were producing 3.5 million barrels daily. Think about that decline for a moment. The world's largest oil reserve holder is operating at roughly 27% of its historical capacity. Now, why does this matter beyond Venezuela's borders? Because of the specific type of crude oil Venezuela produces. This is heavy, sour crude from the Orinoco Belt, and it is absolutely critical to understand that this is not interchangeable with other oil on the global market. United States Gulf Coast refineries are specifically engineered to process this heavy crude. These are multi-billion-dollar facilities with coking and hydrocracking capabilities designed around Venezuelan feedstock characteristics. You cannot simply switch to light sweet crude from Texas shale and expect the same refined product outputs. When refineries lose access to Venezuelan heavy crude, they must import fuel oil or residual streams from the Middle East as substitutes, and that comes at a premium price with logistical complications. Currently, the United States imports approximately 102,000 barrels per day from Venezuela. That might sound modest compared to the 4.1 million barrels daily from Canada or the 254,000 from Saudi Arabia. But remember that for decades, America was far more dependent on Venezuelan oil. The sanctions regime that began in 2019 fundamentally restructured these supply chains, but the underlying refinery economics have not changed. Those Gulf Coast refineries still need heavy crude, and Venezuelan supply disruptions create immediate pressure on diesel and other middle distillate markets. Now let us talk about what is actually happening on the ground right now. The United States has deployed what can only be described as an invasion-ready force to the Caribbean. We are talking about at least 13 warships, 5 support vessels, a nuclear submarine, and the USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group. The Ford is the largest warship in the world, and it arrived in the Caribbean on November 16, 2025, accompanied by 9 air squadrons and more than 4,000 sailors. This represents the heaviest American naval concentration in the Caribbean since the Cold War era. The operational costs are staggering. Conservative estimates place the daily operating cost of this deployment at $18 million per day. Since the initial deployment in late August, the United States taxpayer has already spent over $600 million just on naval operations. That figure does not include the infrastructure build-out in Puerto Rico, where the military is expanding operations at the former Roosevelt Roads Naval Station, or the costs of the 21 airstrikes already conducted that have killed at least 83 people as of mid-November. The second scenario involves full-scale regime change operations. This is where things get genuinely frightening from an economic standpoint. Energy sector analysts estimate that oil prices could spike to between $150 and $200 per barrel in this scenario. That is not sensationalism. That is based on what we have seen in previous supply disruptions in geopolitically critical regions. Remember that approximately 12% of global seaborne oil trade passes through the Caribbean. If this becomes a conflict zone, shipping insurance rates would explode from current levels of about 0.1% of cargo value to potentially 2 to 3%. That increase alone adds billions in cost to global trade. Let me walk you through what a $150 per barrel oil price does to the global economy. Every $10 increase in oil prices typically subtracts approximately 0.2 to 0.3 percentage points from global gross domestic product growth. So a spike from current levels around $70 to $80 per barrel to $150 would represent a 7 to 8 percentage point increase, translating to roughly a 1.4 to 2.4 percentage point reduction in global growth. We are talking about potentially pushing the global economy into recession. For the United States specifically, higher oil prices hit consumers directly through gasoline prices, but also indirectly through higher costs for virtually everything that needs to be transported. Diesel prices are particularly sensitive to disruptions in heavy crude supply because Venezuelan crude is especially suited for middle distillate production. American consumers would see this at the pump, in shipping costs, in food prices, in essentially every sector of the economy. Now let us examine the broader geopolitical economic context. Russia has recently delivered Pantsir S-1 and Buk M2E air defense systems to Venezuela. Russian officials have suggested they could supply Venezuela with advanced Oreshnik missiles, which have a range of approximately 5,500 kilometers and speeds approaching Mach 10, and caliber cruise missiles with ranges between 930 and 1,550 miles. On October 27, 2025, Putin ratified a strategic partnership treaty with Venezuela that solidifies cooperation across economic, political, and military spheres. China has extended approximately $60 billion in loans to Venezuela over the past 2 decades. In 2025, China unveiled a zero-tariff trade agreement with Caracas. Chinese companies have substantial infrastructure investments throughout Venezuela, and Beijing continues to import Venezuelan crude despite United States sanctions. Chinese foreign ministry officials have stated they oppose the use or threat of force in international relations and oppose unilateral law enforcement operations against vessels of other countries. Iran maintains military and economic ties with Venezuela as well. This creates what defense analysts call horizontal escalation risk. If Venezuela, facing existential threat from American military action, decides to escalate the conflict horizontally through semi-deniable proxies, the commodity-related risks expand dramatically. For instance, energy infrastructure in Colombia, especially pipelines, could become targets. The ELN operates extensively in the Venezuela-Colombia borderlands, and the Cano Limon-Cavinas pipeline has been regularly attacked since it opened in 1986, including as recently as July 2025. Colombia exports about 40% of its crude oil directly to the United States, and much of this is medium sour crude, highly suitable for producing middle distillates. There is also significant risk to ammonia supply chains centered on point leases in Trinidad and Tobago, which sits only about 50 kilometers from Venezuela in the Gulf of Paria. Point leases processes Venezuelan gas to produce ammonia for fertilizer. If this facility is disrupted through cyber or kinetic attacks, the effects would reverberate throughout the Americas. The United States and Europe are Trinidad and Tobago's largest ammonia partners, by volume, but Mexico, Chile, and Brazil have disproportionate fertilizer market exposure. Mexico imported 250,000 tons of anhydrous ammonia from Trinidad and Tobago in 2024. Disruption here would not only affect energy markets, but also agricultural production and food prices across multiple continents. Now, I want to address the official United States rationale for this deployment because it is economically nonsensical. The Trump administration claims this is about stopping drug trafficking and illegal immigration. But virtually all fentanyl entering the United States comes overland through Mexico, not by sea from Venezuela. The Caribbean is not a major fentanyl transit route. Moreover, if the objective were genuinely to reduce drug flows, the current approach is counterproductive. Destabilizing Venezuela creates more desperate people looking for ways to make money, often through illegal activities. Regional partners become less inclined to cooperate with the United States to intercept and disrupt smuggling when they see unilateral military action. There is substantial evidence that oil is the actual strategic objective. Maduro himself has written to OPEC stating that the Trump administration wants to seize Venezuela's oil reserves. While the State Department denies this, consider the economic logic. Venezuela holds the world's largest oil reserves. A friendly government in Caracas would give American energy companies access to these reserves. It would also provide an alternative to Russian oil, potentially weakening Russia's economy and its ability to wage war in Ukraine.
Secretary of State Marco Rubio appears focused on reshaping the Western Hemisphere and overturning socialist regimes, viewing this as part of a larger Monroe Doctrine revival.
Speaking of the Monroe Doctrine, this 1920s-era policy essentially declared Latin America to be the imperial backyard of the United States. Trump explicitly embraced this concept during his first term, declaring at the United Nations in 2018 that rejecting foreign interference in the Western Hemisphere has been formal United States policy since President Monroe. What we are seeing now is Monroe Doctrine 2.0, decimating soft power initiatives in favor of deploying or threatening to deploy military force, combined with economic coercion and trade pressure. Let me be clear about what this means for Latin America more broadly. United States officials have made it abundantly clear that they are targeting not just Venezuela, but any Latin American government that maintains strong ties with China, Russia, or Iran. Costa Rica has already aligned with the United States positions on China and 5G technology. Argentina, under President Javier Milei, has become exceptionally cooperative with Washington. Ecuador's President Daniel Noboa, a dual United States citizen and son of the country's richest oligarch, is pushing through measures allowing the United States military to reopen bases and enter Ecuador at any time without oversight. But other major players, like Brazil's Lula and Colombia's Petro, have expressed solidarity with Venezuela and criticized American military buildup. This creates profound uncertainty for investment throughout the region. If you are a company considering long-term infrastructure investment in Latin America, how do you price in the risk of military conflict or regime change operations? What happens to your contracts, your property rights, your ability to repatriate profits if the United States decides a particular government is unacceptable? This uncertainty itself has economic costs through reduced investment, higher risk premiums, and capital flight. Now, let us talk about the defense industry economics, because there are clear winners in this scenario. Lockheed Martin and Raytheon Technologies are the primary beneficiaries of the Caribbean military buildup.
Lockheed secured a $9.5 billion contract for joint air-to-surface standoff missile and long-range anti-ship missile systems. These are critical for targeting infrastructure and maritime threats.
Raytheon has substantial contracts for advanced medium-range air-to-air missiles and maintains the Aegis combat systems deployed on the destroyers operating in the Caribbean. The procurement costs for the weapon systems involved are staggering. Arleigh Burke-class destroyers cost about $2.5 billion each just to procure. The AC-130J Ghost Rider aerial gunship costs $165 million per unit. Landing craft, air cushion, hovercraft cost about $90 million each. The destroyers and cruisers deployed in the Caribbean carry an estimated 115 Tomahawk missiles each, and the Navy recently authorized purchase of 837 upgraded maritime strike Tomahawks at approximately $1.3 million each. If significant munitions are expended and need to be replenished, we are talking about billions in additional defense spending. Boeing has a $154 million contract to sustain KC-135 aerial refueling capabilities for Caribbean operations. The United States Department of Defense fiscal year 2025 budget is $850 billion, with nearly half allocated to operations and maintenance. Pentagon documents indicate plans to maintain this military presence through at least 2028 based on food service and logistics contracts. Defense analysts say the procurement duration and effort level point to these operations continuing at current levels for several years. So we have a self-perpetuating dynamic where military deployment drives defense spending, which benefits major contractors, which creates political constituencies supporting continued military engagement. Meanwhile, the actual operational costs continue to accumulate at $18 million per day, over $600 million spent already with no clear endpoint in sight. I want to address something that deeply troubles me. From an economic efficiency standpoint, the opportunity cost of this spending. While the United States is spending hundreds of millions on military operations in the Caribbean, the federal government faces a funding crisis. The ongoing government shutdown has stretched beyond 30 days, and funding for the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program is drying up. Approximately 42 million Americans who rely on SNAP benefits are at risk of losing them. The administration has refused to tap into contingency funds for domestic food assistance while simultaneously spending over $18 million daily on military operations in the Caribbean. Think about that allocation of resources. We are spending hundreds of millions to conduct military operations that have already killed over 80 people, most confirmed as civilians, while millions of Americans face food insecurity. From a pure economic efficiency standpoint, this represents a massive misallocation of scarce public resources toward objectives that are not clearly defined and away from domestic needs that are absolutely critical. Now, let me address the most troubling economic scenario: prolonged conflict or a frozen conflict that becomes the new normal. This is what some analysts consider the most likely outcome. Neither side wants full-scale war, but neither can back down without unacceptable losses. So we end up with a permanent state of military tension, periodic strikes, economic sanctions that never fully lift, and Venezuela remaining unable to develop its oil resources while also being unable to pursue alternative development paths. In this scenario, Venezuela continues to produce roughly 1 million barrels per day, well below potential. Global heavy crude markets remain tight, keeping diesel prices elevated. United States taxpayers continue funding an $18 million per day naval presence indefinitely. Defense contractors profit from sustained weapons procurement and maintenance contracts. Latin American countries face ongoing uncertainty that suppresses investment and growth. Russia and China deepen their involvement in the region, creating additional geopolitical complications. This frozen conflict scenario might seem preferable to full-scale war, and in human terms, it certainly is. But economically, it represents a persistent drag on global growth. Elevated oil prices, suppressed Latin American investment, massive ongoing military expenditure with no clear benefit, disrupted trade relationships, and increasing fragmentation of the global economy along geopolitical lines. The International Energy Agency forecasts that world oil demand will increase by 720,000 barrels per day in 2025, with supply projected to rise by 1.8 million barrels per day. In the absence of major disruption, oil markets in 2025 look reasonably well supplied. But notice the critical qualifier: in the absence of major disruption. Venezuela represents exactly the kind of major disruption that could throw these projections completely off track. I also want to address claims I have heard that this could somehow be economically beneficial if it leads to a post-intervention boom in Venezuelan oil production. The scenario goes like this: United States installs friendly government, sanctions lift, massive investment flows in, Venezuelan production surges back toward historical levels of 3 to 4 million barrels per day. Global oil prices fall. American consumers benefit. Here is why that scenario is fantasy economics. First, rebuilding infrastructure requires that $100 to $200 billion in investment I mentioned, and that takes at least a decade, even under ideal conditions. Second, any new Venezuelan government would struggle against factions of the military, state institutions, and militias loyal to Maduro, creating mass instability. The chaos would spill over into neighboring countries like Colombia, threatening fragile peace agreements and jeopardizing anti-drug efforts in the rest of South America. Third, the political risk premium would be enormous. Private investors would demand extraordinary returns to deploy capital in a country that just went through regime change via foreign military intervention. Fourth, the technology and expertise needed to operate Venezuela's complex heavy crude extraction and upgrading processes have atrophied dramatically. You cannot just flip a switch and restore production after years of underinvestment and mismanagement. Most importantly, this optimistic scenario assumes stable oil prices high enough to justify the investment. But the entire trajectory of energy markets is toward lower long-term prices as renewable energy, electric vehicles, and efficiency improvements reduce oil demand. By the time Venezuelan production could theoretically be restored to peak levels, we might be in a world where oil at $60 or $70 per barrel is the new normal, making the economics of that massive infrastructure investment extremely questionable. So what are we left with? An incredibly expensive military deployment, mounting human costs, massive geopolitical risks, the potential for catastrophic oil price spikes if conflict escalates, opportunity costs from foregone domestic spending, and even in the best case scenario, a timeline of many years and hundreds of billions of dollars before any potential benefit materializes, all while the fundamental economics of the global oil industry may be shifting in ways that undermine the entire strategic rationale. From a strictly economic analytical standpoint, this represents one of the most poorly conceived strategic ventures I have evaluated in decades. The costs are immediate, certain, and massive. The benefits are distant, uncertain, and potentially illusory. The risks include oil price spikes that could trigger global recession, regional destabilization that creates new migration and security challenges, and the collapse of the rules-based international system that has enabled the extraordinary economic growth of the past 75 years. I want to close by emphasizing something that I think is getting lost in the daily news cycle of military deployments and political rhetoric. The global economy depends on predictable rules, enforceable property rights, freedom of navigation, and the peaceful resolution of disputes. When the world's largest economy starts conducting airstrikes in international waters without clear legal authority, when it deploys invasion ready military forces based on rationales that do not withstand scrutiny, when it revives 19th century doctrines of regional hegemony, the economic costs go far beyond immediate oil price impacts. Every country now has to reconsider its assumptions about what the United States might do, what rules actually matter, whether economic integration with the United States-led system is safe or represents unacceptable risk. Capital that would have flowed toward productive investment in Latin America will instead sit idle or flee to perceived safe havens. Trade relationships will be restructured not for efficiency, but for political security. The entire post World War II economic architecture, based on multilateralism and rules based order, erodes further. The tragic irony is that this is all happening in the name of making America stronger and more secure. But long-term American prosperity depends on exactly the kind of stable, rules-based international system that this kind of unilateral military action undermines. There are no economic winners in the scenarios we are now facing in the Caribbean. There are only varying degrees of economic loss, with the most catastrophic scenarios involving widespread conflict and supply disruptions that would devastate the global economy. I sincerely hope that cooler heads will prevail, that diplomatic solutions can be found, and that we can step back from this extremely dangerous situation. Because the alternative, from an economic standpoint, ranges from very bad to absolutely catastrophic. And the costs will be borne not by the policymakers who made these decisions or the defense contractors who profit from them, but by ordinary people around the world who will pay higher prices, face reduced economic opportunities, and potentially experience the kind of economic crisis that we have not seen since the 1970s, oil shocks or worse. That is the economic reality of what we are facing in the Caribbean right now. Thank you.